What if the strangest aspect of the ancient world wasn't the things they constructed, but the materials they constructed them with? Tools and knowledge that have no business existing in the Bronze Age whatsoever. Under museum glass in Baghdad and London, amid collections of clay tablets and stone figurines, sit objects that curators tag with quiet labels: vessel, ornament, use unknown. Neutral terms for items that unsettle archaeologists, because occasionally the earth yields artifacts that do not fit their soil layer. Objects whose precision, whose materials, whose very purpose murmurs of a science the ancient world was never intended to hold. So before the tale draws you deeper, pause a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're attracted to mysteries dwelling in the gap between evidence and the impossible. And if you're still alert, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'd like to envision this query traveling across time zones, much like these artifacts traveled across empires. The discovery starts not with revelation, but with standard excavation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British and French crews excavated the ruins of southern Iraq, Uruk, Nineveh, Nimrud. Their shovels dug into clay toughened by millennia. They anticipated the typical sequence: rough pottery, basic tools, the initial marks of writing, the standard account of civilization learning to stand. What surfaced from the sand instead was elegance. City walls extending for miles, ziggurats oriented to heavenly markers, tablets recording not basic trials, but sophisticated mathematics, ratios, geometry, astronomical charts following Venus with accuracy not equaled for thousands of years. The Sumerians didn't fumble toward civilization. They reached it fully developed around 3200 BC, as if someone had merely flipped on the lights. But amid the thousands of clay tablets and temple bases, excavators continued uncovering other items, small ones, peculiar ones. A rock crystal lens polished smooth and curved, ceramic jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods inside, marked by chemical traces. Diorite sculptures bored with accuracy that copper tools should not accomplish. Metal alloys including elements not local to Mesopotamia. Most were logged with careful phrasing and stowed in museum basements, because these objects posed a disturbance more troubling than absent history. They implied history that was impossible. Consider the precision drilling. When you inspect certain Sumerian-era stone vessels under magnification, you discover drill marks perfectly concentric, carved into stone tougher than the bronze tools of that time. The type of boring that demands either methods we fail to comprehend or instruments we have yet to locate. Archaeologists found comparable anomalies at site after site. Crystal lenses that truly concentrate light. Ceramic copper setups that produce voltage when loaded with acidic fluid. Metallurgical efforts belonging centuries beyond their stratum. The pattern developed gradually, not because the proof was concealed, but because it was awkward. History likes straight paths. Tool A evolves to Tool B. Knowledge builds steadily, generation upon generation. But here in Mesopotamia, refinement emerges before its necessary foundations. The Sumerians chart the skies before they should comprehend astronomy. They handle geometric ratios before mathematics is thought to exist. They outline chemical methods in tablets thousands of years prior to medieval alchemy. And then there are the objects themselves. Small, mysterious, technically superior, resting in museum drawers like shards from a mismatched timeline. One artifact in particular lingers at the fringes of orthodox archaeology. Unearthed in layers tied to Mesopotamian society, now kept behind glass or in storage based on which curator you consult. Its makeup is disturbing: highly pure copper, intentional build, evidence of repeated usage. When researchers replicated similar items, they uncovered something that should not be feasible. They operate not as ritual items, not as symbolic tools, but as devices creating electrical potential or concentrating light with optical accuracy that demands a grasp of physics the ancient world apparently lacked. The academic reaction has mostly been quiet. A few articles with guarded wording, ideas about chance discovery or ritual function misread by modern views. but no fulfilling account for why these items exist or how Bronze Age artisans attained precision, scarcely repeatable with today's hand tools. Meanwhile, the Sumerian tablets themselves provide an unusual form of evidence. Among their lists, king records, and hymns, scribes mention instruments that seem almost technological. Vessels of gleaming copper that contain the fire, stones that clarify sight, liquid blends that solidify like metal. For decades, experts interpreted these as poetic figures. But what if they were inventory entries? And underneath it all, another pattern. The Sumerians did not label their knowledge as invented. They labeled it as restored. Their term for civilization's codes and formulas, the me, was depicted as divine gifts retrieved after a massive catastrophe, after a flood that obliterated the prior world. At night, when conservation labs darken and artifacts settle in their managed settings, you can almost sense the gravity of that term. Restoration, not invention, not finding. The reclaiming of something that once already existed. Just as a fingerprint in dried clay retains the form of the hand that impressed it 5,000 years ago, these artifacts retain the form of knowledge we are not meant to encounter in the Bronze Age. Each a modest, persistent defiance of the timeline we have assembled. Perhaps that explains why they stay so discreetly logged, why most documentaries pass them by, why textbooks favor the tidy tale of steady advancement. Because if one small copper cylinder or crystal lens truly serves as technology, genuine, intentional, engineered technology, then the whole basis of our historical chronology starts to fracture. The sand still conceals more secrets than we have mustered the bravery to dig up. If these artifacts have no place in the Sumerian world, then where did the insight to fashion them truly originate? The answer could reside in a single object awaiting in a museum vault, where temperature and humidity are meticulously regulated. But to comprehend why that item is significant, we must go back to the instant it was extracted from the soil, to the heat and quiet of southern Iraq, where the desert still preserves the shade of forgotten eras. Envision the excavation locations of the early 1900s. British groups under Leonard Woolley at Ur, German archaeologists at Uruk, French teams near Nineveh and Nimrud. These were not fortune seekers pursuing gold. They were academics, anticipating to uncover humanity's initial awkward strides. Rough stone tools, simple clay bowls, the earliest efforts at record-keeping etched into damp soil. The desert provided something completely different. When Woolley's crew sliced through the mound remnants, they encountered layered cities piled like pages in a book. Each stratum disclosed not advancement, but steadiness. The deeper they excavated, the more refined the discoveries grew. Temples with foundations directed to true north. Drainage setups designed with uniform inclines. Tablets packed with business deals. Medical formulas, and star diagrams monitoring celestial shifts over decades. The heat wavered above dig trenches as laborers pulled up basket after basket of finds. Clay seals showing detailed mythical images, cylinder seals rolled over wet clay to confirm authenticity. An idea needing both abstract reasoning and societal confidence. Musical instruments with strings measured exactly, weights and measures uniform over hundreds of miles. Sumer did not inch toward civilization. It entered it in complete splendor. But dispersed among these anticipated discoveries, the tablets, pottery, temple bases, were items that did not entirely match the story. Small irregularities that excavators would carefully wrap in cloth and note with question marks in their field logs. At Nimrud, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard revealed a piece of polished rock crystal shaped into a curved form with optical traits. At diverse Mesopotamian locations, teams located ceramic containers holding copper cylinders, sometimes with iron rods centered inside. The interiors stained by materials implying chemical reactions. Stone vessels crafted from diorite, among the toughest stones, displayed drill holes with flawless concentric circles, as if sliced by machines rather than hand implements. Most of these pieces were logged with purposefully ambiguous phrasing. Ritual object, decorative tool, vessel of unknown function. They were boxed in crates, sent to museums in London, Berlin, Baghdad, and placed quietly in storage drawers or lesser display cases, because they raised issues without simple solutions. The rock crystal lens, for instance, when contemporary researchers inspected it under magnification, they discovered it had been polished with such accuracy that it could concentrate light effectively, demanding a grasp of focal distances and curvature that should not exist in the ancient world. The ceramic copper cylinders, when rebuilt and filled with acidic mixtures, created detectable voltage. The diorite vessels displayed machining traces that copper or bronze tools should not manage to create. These were not rough trials. They were polished products, and they remained in museum collections, labeled but unexplained for decades. One artifact especially captures interest from those prepared to examine closely. It now dwells in climate-controlled storage. Some claim in Baghdad's National Museum. Others assert samples exist in British and German holdings. The precise origin differs by which researcher you ask, but the key traits stay steady. It is a clay jar, approximately cylindrical, roughly 5 inches tall, unglazed, ordinary in appearance, the sort of container that might easily be missed in a group of thousands. But within this specific jar rests a copper cylinder shaped exactly to the inner measurements, and suspended inside the copper cylinder, secured by an asphalt seal at the top, is an iron rod displaying signs of corrosion not solely from age, but from chemical contact. When conservators first cleaned such items, they observed the staining patterns, acidic remnants consistent with materials like vinegar or citrus juice. The copper revealed oxidation in patterns indicating repeated filling and emptying. The iron rod's corrosion concentrated where it would have been immersed in liquid. In the 1930s, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig, working in Iraq, studied several of these and suggested something that deeply unsettled his peers. They could be galvanic cells, primitive batteries. His notion was mostly overlooked, too bizarre, too out of place. Batteries need not only materials, but comprehension, knowledge of electrochemistry, of how different metals in acidic solutions generate electrical potential. The ancient world was not meant to have that insight, but then researchers constructed replicas. They filled them with vinegar, placed the copper and iron parts precisely as in the original artifacts, and recorded the outcomes. Voltage modest but detectable, sufficient to run electroplating tasks, or perhaps to produce a sense of divine presence in temple ceremonies. Enough to demonstrate the design was no coincidence. The rock crystal lenses pose a comparable issue. To polish crystal into an exact optical curve demands not merely patience, but geometric comprehension. You must grasp how light curves, how curvature influences focus. The Nimrud lens, when tested, displayed optical traits consistent with intentional engineering, not the haphazard shine of decorative labor. And this is where the Sumerian chronology grows truly disturbing. These are not solitary anomalies. They form a pattern. Across Mesopotamian locations, archaeologists repeatedly uncovered objects requiring more technical insight than the Bronze Age was supposed to possess. Precision boring in tough stone, intricate alloys, chemical methods outlined in tablets, astronomical notes needing generational tracking. Sumer already defies our grasp by emerging too refined too rapidly. But these artifacts, these operational devices, drive the query deeper. They imply not merely advanced culture, but advanced science, applied physics, practical chemistry, engineering with intent. The copper and clay vessels were not created once by chance. Multiple instances exist with uniform building approaches. The crystal lenses surface at various sites, polished to comparable standards. The precision drilling emerges across hundreds of stone vessels, all showing the same machining features. Someone knew what they were accomplishing, and they knew it far before our textbooks claim such knowledge arose. The artifacts rest in their climate-regulated settings, small and silent. Most museum guests pass them without another look. They seem primitive beside the majestic statues and golden riches. But that is exactly what makes them threatening to the established account. Because if these objects genuinely operate as technology, if they embody applied scientific insight in the 3rd millennium BC, then every premise about the straight-line growth of human civilization must be reassessed. The question is not if ancient people were smart. We know they were. The question is the source of this specific smartness. How did Bronze Age artisans master chemical reactions for electrical production? Who instructed them in optical rules? What lineage kept this knowledge when it could not stem from basic trial and error? The desert wind still sweeps across the ruins of Uruk and Ur, bearing dust that could hold copper flakes, crystal shards, ancient chemistry molecules. And in the vaults behind secured doors and archive tags, the artifacts await. But what precisely is this artifact? And why does it shatter the ancient world's rules so utterly that many scholars would prefer not to discuss it whatsoever? The most examined specimen was found in 1936 at Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad, in a layer dated to about 250 BC, the Parthian period. But the design and similar objects from earlier Mesopotamian settings indicate knowledge predating the Parthians by centuries, possibly passed from Sumerian and Babylonian scientific lines. The item measures approximately 13 centimeters tall and 8 centimeters in diameter. At initial view, it is unremarkable. A terracotta jar, pale yellow-brown with a slim neck, the type that might have contained wine, oil, or grain. Thousands of like jars fill museum storerooms globally, but this one differs. Inside the clay container rests a copper cylinder fitted so exactly to the interior that barely any space exists between metal and ceramic. The copper sheet was rolled and joined along a seam, sign of managed metalworking. The copper cylinder's bottom is closed with a soldered copper disc. At the top, an asphalt plug holds all in place, and through that plug extends an iron rod placed centrally, suspended to avoid touching the copper walls. When Wilhelm König first studied it in the Baghdad Museum, he noted the iron rod was severely corroded, but not evenly, the pattern implying contact with an acidic material, something stronger than mere groundwater. The copper cylinder displayed green oxidation marks, especially along inner surfaces, consistent with repeated exposure to an electrolyte solution. The archaeological setting is key here. The artifact appeared with other household goods: clay pots, farming implements, oil lamps, tablets noting grain deals. Nothing especially ritualistic. Nothing indicating temple ceremony or royal hoard. It was in a residence, perhaps a workshop, kept with routine items. Yet its build implies anything but routine intent. Examine the engineering more closely. The copper cylinder's wall thickness remains strikingly uniform, roughly 1 millimeter everywhere. The iron rod is aligned with care, secured at the center by the asphalt seal to avoid copper contact. This is no chance setup. This is intentional design, the sort needing both planning and purpose. When you grasp a replica in your hands, you can sense the intense weight. The parts assemble with logic implying function above symbolism. The sealed base stops leaks. The top's narrow opening permits filling and emptying. The central rod hangs in space, awaiting action around it. König's reading was direct but extreme. This was a galvanic cell, a battery. The archaeological community responded with courteous doubt. Ritual objects, they proposed. Perhaps a scroll holder, maybe a container for sacred writings. The iron rod might be a support. The copper lining could block moisture harm. The asphalt seal just fine workmanship. But then researchers at the British Science Museum constructed exact replicas in 1978. They filled the vessels with diverse acidic mixtures: grape juice, vinegar, copper sulfate. They placed the copper cylinder and iron rod in the original's exact arrangement and measured voltage between 0.8 and nearly 2 volts based on the electrolyte, enough potential to drive electroplating operations, like coating silver with gold, or perhaps to generate tingling for temple initiates, touching holy items, making divine presence feel physically electric. The tests proved the design functions. Whether it was meant to function that way stays the awkward question scholars often evade. Meanwhile, the rock crystal lenses offer their own engineering puzzle. The Nimrud lens, uncovered by Layard in the 1850s, is an oval polished rock crystal about 4 centimeters long, one surface flat, the other ground into an exact curve. Under magnification, it displays no haphazard scratches or uneven polish. The curvature is purposeful, steady, calculated mathematically. Modern optical checks confirm a focal length of roughly 11 centimeters and magnification up to 3 times. It might have served to inspect fine details for engraving cylinder seals, perhaps for star observations or even igniting fires by concentrating sunlight. But making such an item demands optics understanding, that curved surfaces curve light, that varied curvatures yield varied focal lengths, that rock crystal's clarity surpasses polished metal. This is not insight you trip over while crafting decorative beads. The standard explanation claims these lenses were simply decorative jewelry inserts for furniture, symbolic items symbolizing a god's eye. But that claim collapses when faced with the grinding's accuracy. Decorative items need no precise focal lengths. These lenses perform what lenses should: focus light. Here the issue that keeps emerging. Whether we are studying the copper and clay vessels or the crystal lenses, we confront the same disturbing truth. These items demand prior knowledge. To assemble a working galvanic cell, you must comprehend that varied metals in acidic solutions generate electrical potential. You must know the metals cannot touch, that the electrolyte must connect both, that the setup is crucial. This is not trial and error. This is applied electrochemistry. To polish an optical lens, you need geometric rules. You must grasp how light bends through curved surfaces, how focal length connects to curvature, how crystal purity impacts image quality. You require both theoretical insight and practical skill. And yet, our chronology positions these objects in times when such insight supposedly did not exist. The Parthians inherited Mesopotamian scientific traditions, yes. But those traditions lead back through Babylon to Sumer. Cultures we have learned were just uncovering agriculture and basic metallurgy. The artifacts rest in their display cases, small enough to hold in your palm, but bearing implications too vast to catalog easily. They imply not primitive trials, but mature technology, not chance discovery, but deliberate engineering, not the start of science, but perhaps its remains. Is this artifact a solitary historical mishap, or merely one element of a far bigger pattern concealed in Mesopotamia's ruins? The answer surfaces when you cease viewing individual oddities and begin perceiving the group as a unit. Stroll through the storage spaces of the British Museum, the Baghdad Museum, the Louvre, past renowned statues and golden riches, tucked in drawers marked miscellaneous, or shown without emphasis, sits a full category of objects sharing one alarming trait. They are too advanced for their creation time. The drill holes surface first, exact circular piercings in stone that should have withstood ancient implements. Diorite vessels from Sumerian sites display perfectly cylindrical bores, some reaching several inches deep. Diorite scores 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, tougher than any copper or bronze tool the Sumerians supposedly held. Yet the drill marks are smooth, concentric, showing the sort of steady pressure and rotation speed that implies something more managed than a hand-cranked bow drill. Petrie found similar anomalies in Egypt during his 1880s surveys. He gauged core samples pulled from granite and diorite, discovering spiral grooves indicating the drill sank into the stone at a pace far surpassing what copper tools should manage. He figured some drills must have sliced through granite with a ton of force, advancing at rates that led him to doubt the whole accepted ancient tool list. In Mesopotamia, the same unattainable precision recurs. Stone bowls shaped from materials that should have required months to form show symmetrical curves and even wall thickness. The interiors are smooth, the rims flawlessly level. When inspected under magnification, the polishing traces run in paths suggesting rotational tools, something spinning steadily, not the uneven hand motions of manual rubbing. But the drilling is merely one strand in a broader weave. Metal analysis uncovers another. Bronze Age Mesopotamian sites have produced metal items with alloy mixes that should not exist. Small tools and decorative pieces show traces of nickel, antimony, and other elements not indigenous to the area. Someone was either bringing in exotic metals from immense distances or possessed metallurgical insight, allowing exact blending of trace elements. At Tepe Gara, a northern Iraq site with layers predating Sumer, archaeologists revealed copper objects dated to 5000 BC, shifting metalworking into eras traditionally tied to stone tools only. The refinement emerges earlier than anticipated, as if the technology arrived fully formed rather than growing slowly from rough trials. Meanwhile, those crystal lenses are not singular. Multiple specimens exist across Mesopotamian sites, all polished with comparable accuracy. Some researchers contend they are decorative inlays, but the explanation weakens when you inspect the optical quality. These objects concentrate light. They enlarge. They fulfill the role lenses are meant to fulfill, which implies their creators understood that role. The pattern stretches beyond tools and technical items. Administrative artifacts disclose mathematical refinement that echoes the physical accuracy. Clay tablets recording base 60 calculations, geometric formulas for measuring fields, astronomical notes tracking planetary shifts over years. The Sumerians split the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, practices we use still today. This degree of abstract mathematical thought does not arise from societies battling basic existence. And then you glance beyond Mesopotamia, and the pattern widens more. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom's precision stonework offers similar enigmas. The granite sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber displays tool marks that Petrie called astonishing. The inner corners are sharp, the surfaces flat to within 1/1000th of an inch. The blocks join so closely that a razor blade scarcely fits between them. Whether this signifies lost methods or just immense patience stays debated, but it shows abilities that reconstructions of ancient technology find hard to account for. In Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe shifts the timeline of refined building even farther back to about 9500 BC. Massive T-shaped pillars, some 20 tons heavy, set in circles with obvious astronomical orientations. Detailed carvings of animals and abstract signs adorn the stone. This was not constructed by nomadic hunter-gatherers barely surviving. This demanded organization, planning, specialized work, and geometric grasp. The Indus Valley civilization, contemporary with Sumer, displays similar unforeseen refinement. Cities arranged on exact grid layouts, standardized weights and measures over hundreds of miles, advanced drainage, urban planning unmatched in Europe until Roman eras. And like Sumer, the Indus Valley surfaces suddenly in the record, already developed. The connection among these cultures is not diffusion or contact, at least not demonstrably. It is the common trait of entering the historical scene already advanced, already holding knowledge that should have needed centuries to gather. Back in those museum storage rooms, the miscellaneous artifacts await in their climate-controlled drawers, each one logged cautiously. Vessel of unknown purpose, ritual implement, decorative object. The labels are deliberately vague because precise reading invites uneasy questions. If you term a copper and clay cylinder a battery, you must clarify where Bronze Age people acquired electrochemistry. If you term a ground crystal an optical lens, you must clarify who taught them focal lengths. If you admit drill holes in diorite need advanced tool tech, you must overhaul the whole timeline of human technical growth. So the objects get neutral labels and silent placement amid thousands of others. They miss textbooks. They seldom show in documentaries. They inhabit archaeology's edges, recognized but not clarified, present but not folded into the standard tale. Yet together, they create a pattern too steady to reject. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, Anatolia to Indus, evidence implies cultures held technical insight beyond our historical predictions. not merely clever craft or patient ability, but applied scientific grasp of materials, mathematics, physical rules. The copper and clay artifact is no anomaly. It is an instance, one part of a technological lineage we have only partly unearthed, partly grasped, and mostly disregarded because it clashes with the story we tell ourselves of human progress's slow advance. If the Earth holds technology mismatched to the timeline, do the ancient texts ever confess that their knowledge originated from somewhere older, perhaps from someone else? The answer rests pressed into clay, awaiting in cuneiform script that has endured 5 millennia. The Sumerians and their followers, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, were compulsive recorders. They noted everything: grain receipts, legal arguments, astronomical sightings, medical recipes, temple possession inventories. These were not poetic works or mythical tales. They were administrative logs, technical guides, catalogs of actual daily life objects. And concealed in that official language are descriptions sounding eerily like the artifacts collecting dust in museum storage. In temple inventory lists from Uruk, scribes logged ritual objects with exact terms. Among expected items, clay lamps, ceremonial daggers, incense burners, appear phrases translating clumsily into modern tongues, vessels of shining copper that contain the fire of heaven. At first look, this seems metaphor, perhaps a poetic description for oil lamps or braziers in religious rites, but the detail sharpens. These vessels differ from regular lamps. They are noted as having inner iron rods and being filled with sharp water. Sharp water, a term in various contexts for acidic liquids, possibly vinegar or fermented fruit juices. The vessels burn no oil. They are loaded with liquid and somehow yield an effect tied to divine presence. When you set this description next to the copper and clay artifact, the one with an iron rod hung in a copper cylinder made to hold liquid, the similarity grows harder to reject as coincidence. Other tablets reference stones that bring the distant close, or stones of clarity that illuminate darkness. These surface in tool lists for artisans, especially seal cutters carving intricate patterns into small cylinder seals. The descriptions stress clarity, precision, the capacity to see fine details the naked eye could overlook. Rock crystal lenses, objects that enlarge, tools for detailed close work. The language is cautious, technical, specific. These are not vague mythical allusions, but inventory entries distinguishing one tool type from another. The scribes knew these objects were real because they tallied them, cataloged them, noted transfers between temples or workshops. Medical tablets provide another glimpse into technical insight. Sumerian doctors recorded compound recipes with exact measures and multi-step methods. Mix copper salts with sour grape juice until the liquid greens. Apply to skin with bronze knife, not iron. This is not folk cure speculation. It is chemistry. The directive to shun iron tools with certain copper mixes implies grasp of how metals react variably with acids. Other texts outline blends that harden like metal, but are not, possibly early cements or bitumen-based compounds. Instructions detail heating temperatures, cooling periods, proper ingredient ratios. The accuracy suggests tested insight, repeated methods, grasped principles. But perhaps most telling is the Sumerian notion of the me, a word without direct English match. The me were divine codes, cosmic rules, civilization's blueprints themselves. They covered everything from kingship and priesthood to metallurgy, mathematics, agricultural methods. In Sumerian view, the me were not human inventions. They were God-given, restored post-catastrophe, brought from heaven to reconstruct what was lost. The phrasing is steady across hundreds of texts. Knowledge from elsewhere. Civilization not built from nothing. It was recalled, reclaimed, restored. The Eridu-Genesis, among the oldest Sumerian texts, outlines the start of cities, agriculture, human culture. But it speaks of these arising after great destruction, after floods erased what preceded. The gods choose to spare humanity and civilization's seeds by alerting King Ziusudra to construct a boat and save not merely living beings, but knowledge, the me. This framing implies continuity, not creation. The Sumerians viewed themselves as heirs, not creators. When you revisit the physical artifacts with this textual backdrop, they change from anomalies to pieces of a recalled system. The copper and clay vessel is no accidental find. It is the tangible form of those shining copper vessels logged in temple inventories. The crystal lenses are no decorative mishaps. They are the clarity stones listed in artisan tool records. The texts describe items matching what archaeologists uncovered. The issue is that both items and descriptions demand technological grasp. Our timeline does not allow it. To intentionally build a galvanic cell needs electrochemical insight. To log it as a tool containing heaven's fire needs observed effects, perhaps mild electric tingle, metal electroplating, or another unidentified use. To polish optical lenses requires light refraction grasp. To describe them as tools making distant near implies practical application, not symbolic sense. The tablets also mention a pre-temple, pre-city era when the world differed. They speak of antediluvian kings ruling impossible durations, not metaphor, but record. They outline knowledge systems existing before the flood rose from the earth. And here, the artifact in its museum vault starts to appear less like an invention and more like a survivor. A bit of technical insight that endured the catastrophe, kept in scribes and artisans' hands who upheld the tradition even without full grasp of its sources. The copper cylinder, the iron rod, the clay vessel. These are not Parthian novelties. They are echoes of something elder, constructed per instructions transmitted through generations, logged in inventories tracing to Sumerian temple archives where the me were guarded and passed on carefully. The texts acknowledge what the artifacts imply. This knowledge came from elsewhere, some prior era, some vanished world that the Sumerians devoted their whole civilization to recalling and restoring. If their knowledge was restored following some vast catastrophe, what precisely occurred to the world before Sumer? The clue surfaced first, not in tablets, but in mud, a thick, barren silt layer that Leonard Woolley's team revealed at Ur in 1929. They had been excavating occupation layers, slicing down through centuries of human dwelling, pottery fragments, clay tablets, building bases, the usual ancient city stratification. Then abruptly the artifacts halted. Clean clay, no pottery, no ash, no debris, just even river silt 8 feet thick in spots, extending over the whole dig site. Woolley continued digging. Below that barren layer, human activity restarted. Different pottery designs, earlier building methods, signs of a prosperous community buried entirely by flood deposits, then rebuilt atop centuries later. His team gauged the flood layer's scope across various Ur-dig sites. It was not local. It blanketed the whole ancient city area, a huge flood that interred the prior settlement under meters of river-laid clay. Woolley figured such a flood would need water levels vastly beyond regular seasonal rises. This was not the Euphrates spilling banks in spring thaw. This was disastrous flooding. Similar flood deposits emerged at other Mesopotamian sites. Digs at Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak, and Nineveh showed matching barren layers. Thick water-deposited sediment dividing older occupation from newer building. Dates differed slightly by site, implying perhaps multiple floods between 3000 and 2900 BC, or one immense event impacting areas at varied times. Geologically, the proof indicated something actual, not the biblical worldwide deluge, but surely regional ruin on a scale that would erase whole populations, demolish cities, sever the continuity of any prior civilization. And that is when the ancient texts began to make uneasy sense. The Sumerian king list outlines the pre-flood world with odd accuracy. It names cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. It lists kings ruling impossibly long, tens of thousands of years. Then the repeated line across Mesopotamian works. The flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descends anew, but reign lengths contract sharply from 30,000-year spans to decades and centuries, as if something fundamentally altered about the world, or time's measurement or recall. The Gilgamesh epic in its Akkadian form narrates through Utnapishtim, a man alerted by god Ea to construct a boat and rescue himself, family, life's seeds from approaching deluge. Instructions specific: seal vessel with bitumen, load animals and craftsmen, bring all living things seed. When flood arrives, described with frightening clarity, for 6 days and nights winds raged. Torrent, tempest, flood engulfed the world. Waters recede. Utnapishtim's boat grounds on mountain. He sends birds to check dry land. The Sumerian version, Ziusudra's story, tells the same with older language. Noah's biblical tale mirrors the framework so exactly that scholars long see them as versions of shared cultural recall. But here what makes flood tales especially notable: they describe not just water and ruin, they describe knowledge's saving. Utnapishtim takes craftsmen aboard, people with abilities, technical insight, rebuilding capacity. The Mi civilization's divine codes are expressly saved and restored post-waters. This is recall framed as continuity. The pre-flood world held something valuable to preserve, not merely biological life, but cultural and technical legacy. And viewing the archaeological chronology, the break becomes evident. Before Sumer's abrupt rise around 3200 BC, earlier settlements existed. Ubaid culture, Halaf culture showing steady growth of pottery, farming, basic social setup. Then the flood layer. Then Sumer arrives, not as Ubaid extension but qualitatively distinct, more refined, more structured, holding knowledge seeming to surpass prior cultures. Meanwhile, even older sites suggest abilities making Sumer's refinement less odd and more part of extended pattern. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey predates Sumer by over 6,000 years. Built around 9,500 BC, it features massive T-shaped limestone pillars in circular enclosures. Some pillars up to 20 tons. Quarried, moved, shaped, raised by people we learned were nomadic hunter-gatherers just starting agriculture trials. The craftsmanship extraordinary, intricate animal carvings, lions, foxes, snakes, scorpions, adorned pillars, abstract symbols in ordered patterns, circular enclosures aligned to specific celestial points, implying astronomical knowledge. This was not rough megalithic piling. This was precise engineering needing organization, planning, mathematical grasp, likely social structure for labor coordination. Then around 8000 BC, Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried, enclosures filled with debris, abandoned. Why unknown, but pattern implies purposeful end rather than catastrophic ruin. After Göbekli Tepe, record shows apparent regression, simpler buildings, less grand architecture. Then millennia later, Sumer emerges with its refined knowledge systems. The timeline flows not smoothly. It waves, sophistication, decline, revival. As if human civilization endured multiple cycles of ascent and disruption, each fresh bloom reconstructing from prior remnants. Place the copper and clay artifact in this framework. If a technological tradition predated the great 3rd millennium BC floods, a tradition refined enough for electrochemistry, optics, precision metalwork, then catastrophic flooding would destroy most physical proof. Cities submerged, clay tablet libraries dissolved in water, tools buried under silt meters. But knowledge endures in other ways. Survivors' memories, oral traditions from master artisans to apprentices, sacred texts kept by priestly groups viewing themselves as ancient wisdom's keepers. In the Mi, those divine civilization blueprints the Sumerians claimed restored, not invented. Perhaps Sumerian innovation was actually remembrance. The tablets they inscribed, temples they erected, astronomical charts they kept. These could be reconstructions from catastrophe-preserved fragments. The copper and clay vessels, crystal lenses, precision boring methods. These could be surviving technologies from pre-flood world, upheld by specialist groups grasping function, even if wider culture forgot full theoretical base. Woolly's flood layer rests in the stratigraphy like a bookmark signaling one chapter's close and another's start. Above it, Sumer flourishes with knowledge seeming too whole, too ordered for pure novelty. Below it, signs of prior occupation, settlements with own refinement, now interred and partial. And farther back, sites like Göbekli Tepe show human capacity for complex engineering, star observation, organized building, reaches much deeper into prehistory than textbooks usually admit. The pre-Sumer world was not vacant. It held cultures whose feats we are just starting to acknowledge, cultures rising and falling, leaving sufficient proof to imply human civilization's timeline is far more intricate and interrupted than the smooth linear advance we like to envision. If Sumer rebuilt atop a drowned world's ruins, how did they sustain its memory? And could that memory be embedded in their language and science as deeply as in artifacts? The answer dwells in the oldest words we can still read, and the mathematical system we still employ for measuring time and space. Sumerian is a phantom language. It fits no known linguistic group, not Semitic like Akkadian or Hebrew, not Indo-European like Greek or Sanskrit, unrelated to any tongue spoken in nearby areas or elsewhere worldwide. It stands solitary in human speech history, an isolate emerging fully shaped in earliest written records around 3200 BC, with no evident forebears, no basic forerunners, no evolutionary path back to simpler shapes. When archaeologists first decoded cuneiform in the 19th century, they expected linguistic baby steps, basic word lists, rough grammar, a culture's clumsy tries at symbolizing speech. Instead, earliest Sumerian tablets show complex grammar, refined vocabulary, abstract ideas needing linguistic maturity. The verb system itself is notably complex with tenses, aspects, moods permitting exact expression of time, cause, possibility. The vocabulary holds specialized technical words for architectural parts, astronomical events, mathematical actions, administrative routines. This is no language developing. It is a language already developed, used by scribes who plainly inherited rather than created it. Where from? The lack of linguistic kin implies either immense age, so ancient any related tongues disappeared traceless, or isolation from other groups, so prolonged connections grew unrecognizable. Some linguists suggested ties to India's Dravidian languages or obscure Caucasus families, but these stay conjectural at best. What we know surely is Sumerian conveyed information across centuries with striking accuracy. The writing system, cuneiform, developed from pictographic signs to abstract wedge marks representing sounds and ideas. This dual role lets scribes encode complex thoughts efficiently, preserving not merely words, but the technical knowledge words detailed. Meanwhile, the mathematical framework in Sumerian culture shows refinement that should not exist at civilization's supposed start. Base 60 mathematics. The sexagesimal system surfaces in earliest Sumerian records already mature and ordered. They divided the circle into 360 degrees. They measured time in 60 units, 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour. They used base 60 fractions for calculations our base 10 system manages clumsily. Why base 60? Standard explanation claims because 60 has many divisors, divisible evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This eases fractional math. 1/3 of 60 is 20, 1/4 is 15, 1/5 is 12. Practical for a civilization managing trade, land survey, resource allocation. But that explanation presumes someone chose base 60 deliberately for mathematical ease. It presumes abstract mathematical thought level, grasping divisibility traits, seeing multiple factors utility that should not exist in a culture supposedly creating mathematics anew. The alternative, base 60 inherited, handed from earlier tradition that already determined the system's benefits and embedded it deeply in astronomical sighting, timekeeping, geometric computation. So later cultures just kept it without probing origins. Sumerian mathematical tablets show applied geometry, calculating irregular field areas, figuring grain storage volumes, solving quadratic equations for building. They applied Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They computed square and cube roots. They grasped ratios, proportions, geometric progressions. Clay tablets from Old Babylonian era, 2600 BC, display scribal students copying math problems and answers. These are not basic drills. They are advanced computations kept in a teaching line tracing centuries to Sumerian origins. The Babylonians, political successors to the Sumerians, kept studying Sumerian as scholarly tongue long after it stopped being spoken. For them, Sumerian resembled Latin in medieval Europe, a dead language sustained for religious, legal, scientific aims. Priestly schools instructed young scribes to read and write Sumerian, copy ancient texts, preserve knowledge coded in that odd, isolate language. Technical manuals copied and recopied over generations. Medical texts, astronomical notes, mathematical methods, all sustained in Sumerian, even as Mesopotamia's spoken tongues shifted to Akkadian, then Aramaic. The language became a preservation container, bearing technical knowledge through centuries of political turmoil and cultural shift. And here the artifact resurfaces with fresh importance. Consider the accuracy needed to build the copper and clay vessel. Copper cylinder wall thickness steady within millimeter fractions. Iron rod positioned centrally, suspended at precise alignment. Cylinder diameter to height proportions follow mathematical ratios maximizing surface area touch between copper and acidic electrolyte. This is no chance setup. This is applied geometry, the same geometric thought in Sumerian building plans and field survey tablets. Someone computed optimal sizes, grasped surface area electrical potential link, encoded that insight into reproducible design. Likewise, rock crystal lenses show optical principles, grasp needing geometric computation. A lens's focal length relies on curvature radius, a mathematical tie. To polish crystal deliberately for specific focal length requires knowing that tie and measuring curvature exactly. The artifacts, in short, are mathematics turned physical. They embody numerical and geometric grasp application, the same grasp kept in Sumerian tablets, to practical issues of chemistry and optics. When Babylonian scribes duplicated ancient Sumerian technical texts, they preserved not just words, but scientific rules those words coded. The language became storage for knowledge that might have vanished otherwise. Even if physical tools lost, ruined in floods, buried in wreckage, scattered over deserted cities, instructions for remaking them could endure in clay tablets inscribed in a language upheld by scholarly custom. Perhaps this accounts for Sumer's paradox, emerging suddenly with refined knowledge because that knowledge was not new, it was recalled. The language bore it, the mathematical system coded it. The priestly schools passed it over generations, upholding technical customs even when wider culture might not fully grasp origins. The copper and clay vessels, crystal lenses, precision-drilled stone, these turn not anomalies but verifications, physical survivals of scientific tradition mostly kept in linguistic and mathematical shape. The artifact is the outlier, the rare instance where actual device endured beside written construction instructions. Most earlier worlds' technology lost, but if core principles encoded in specialized language upheld by scribal schools, embedded in mathematical systems for timekeeping and star observation, then those principles could reappear centuries later, used by artisans following ancient recipes they might see as sacred knowledge rather than scientific method. Language turns more than communication. It turns time capsule, bearing refined concepts across catastrophic ruptures that wrecked the physical world. The Sumerians wrote in linguistic isolate, counted base 60, computed with geometric accuracy, described technical devices in temple inventories, not because they created these, but because they inherited a system made to keep them. The artifact rests in its museum vault, a small copper and clay cylinder bridging linguistic preservation and physical fact. The tablets detail it. The mathematical system accounts for its ratios. The language bears the instructions, and the object proves the knowledge real, functional, deliberately engineered. If their language and mathematics bore echoes of lost science, what occurs when modern researchers at last place the artifact under microscope? Does it affirm inheritance myth or reveal it as fancy? The answer arrived in laboratories distant from desert ruins, in museums and facilities-controlled settings where modern analytic tools could inspect what ancient hands crafted. In 1938, Wilhelm König's initial check of copper and clay vessels limited to visual review and basic chemical tests. Noted corrosion patterns, measured sizes, proposed contentious battery idea, but lacked tech for molecular material analysis or exact artifact electrical potential measure. Modern materials science faces no such limits. Spectroscopic check of copper cylinder shows metal purity matching ancient smelting. Roughly 98% copper with arsenic and tin traces. Nothing unusual. Copper from local sources, processed via Mesopotamian metallurgy methods well recorded. The iron rod displays similar era-fitting makeup. Bloomery iron with slag bits typical of ancient reduction ovens. The ceramic vessel is fired clay with organic temper matching Parthian period pottery techniques and earlier Mesopotamian customs. The asphalt seal holding iron rod is natural bitumen common regionally, used widely in ancient building and ceiling. So far, materials affirm the artifact fits its dated era. Nothing exotic, nothing needing explanation past known ancient tech. But then, analysis shifts to corrosion. The iron rod's oxidation pattern unusual. Standard air corrosion yields even rust over exposed areas. This iron displays focused corrosion in certain zones, especially where submersion would occur if vessel filled to specific liquid level. Corrosion products chemical analysis shows acetic acid traces consistent with vinegar or fermented fruit juice. The copper cylinder's inner surface bears green patina, copper acetate from copper acid contact. Distribution not random, heaviest near bottom and inner walls, precisely where repeated filling draining would leave residue over time. This is not slow decay of empty vessel soil buried 2 millennia. This is chemical mark of intentional repeated use with acidic liquids contacting copper and iron together. In 1978, British Science Museum researchers ran definitive reconstruction tests. They made exact replicas of copper and clay vessels using era-appropriate materials, techniques. No modern tools, no industrial pure metals, just copper sheet, clay, iron rods, asphalt put together per ancient setup. They filled vessels with various liquids, grape juice, vinegar, copper sulfate solution, fermented date wine. Then measured electrical potential between copper cylinder and iron rod. Results unambiguous. With vinegar electrolyte, vessels produced 0.8 to 1.1 volts. With copper sulfate, voltage hit nearly 2 volts. Current weak, milliamps, but steady and lasting while electrolyte fresh. Later 2002 experiments by Smith College students repeated these, extended them, showing series-connected vessels generated voltage enough for electroplating silver with gold, a technique ancient Mesopotamian metalworkers knew, but method previously unclarified. The vessels function not as symbolic items or ritual tools, but as working galvanic cells creating measurable electrical current via basic electrochemical reactions. Meanwhile, rock crystal lenses faced similar examination. Nimrud lens optical tests confirmed approximately 11 centimeters focal length with 3 times magnification potential. Grinding shows no modern machine tool evidence. Surface has minor irregularities, matching hand polishing with abrasive powders, but curvature remarkably exact. When measured with modern interferometry, lens surface varies from ideal spherical curve by under 0.5 millimeters across whole face. That consistency demands not just patient polishing, but grasp of curvature, focal length, tie, and method for testing focal traits during process. You do not polish crystal accidentally to specific focal length. You do it intentionally, monitoring progress, adjusting on optical results. This implies theoretical insight, curved transparent materials, focus light, and practical method, how to test, refine curve. Comparative analysis shows where artifacts meet expectations and exceed. Metalworking techniques era appropriate. Ancient Mesopotamian smiths could roll copper sheet, solder seams, work bloomery iron. Ceramic firing temps and clay makeup match period pottery. Asphalt waterproofing standard for region era. What exceeds? Assembly precision and design specificity. Copper cylinder fits ceramic vessel with minimal gap, needing careful measure, shaping. Iron rod centered, held exactly by asphalt seal, avoiding copper walls. Components proportions, cylinder diameter, rod length, vessel height, follow ratios maximizing electrolyte surface contacts. Civilizations expanded as empires connected distant peoples, as trade routes spread ideas across continents. Religious systems needed to become more abstract, more universal. A god who was specifically the patron of Nippur and spoke only Sumerian couldn't serve a multicultural empire spanning from Egypt to India. So the divine council structure generalized. The concept of cosmic hierarchy persisted. But the specifics, the 50 Anunnaki with their individual names and city associations, became too localized, too particular. The age demanded gods who could be worshipped anywhere, whose authority wasn't bound to specific rivers and specific temples. The old forms weren't destroyed so much as outgrown. Like a child who stops playing with toys, not because toys are bad, but because different activities now serve the developmental needs that play once fulfilled. This suggests something profound about the Anunnaki's departure. They didn't leave because they were defeated or exposed as fraudulent. They left because the human consciousness that sustained them evolved into forms they couldn't adapt to. The world became larger, more connected, more cosmopolitan. The old gods of place and particular cities couldn't scale to meet that expansion. New religious technologies, monotheism, universal ethics, portable scriptures proved more effective at organizing meaning across diverse populations. The Anunnaki fulfilled their role perfectly for the world they were designed for. They provided cosmic order for independent city-states, each needing divine legitimacy for their rulers and sacred structure for their social hierarchies. When that world ended, when cities became provinces, when empires erased borders, when trade made every place less distinct, the Anunnaki's specific form of presence became obsolete. But their essence, the human need for cosmic order, for divine hierarchy, for sacred structure that makes the universe comprehensible, that didn't die. It's still active in every religious system that imagines heaven as organized, that structures spiritual authority in ranks, that sees the cosmos as governed rather than random. The Anunnaki are gone only in the way that Latin is a dead language, meaning nobody speaks it natively anymore. But its structure survives in the Romance languages, in scientific terminology, in legal phrases, in the grammar that shapes how millions of people still think. What died wasn't the Anunnaki themselves, but the specific cultural linguistic ritual matrix that made them perceptible in that particular form. The tablet stopped being read. The language stopped being spoken. The rituals stopped being performed. And gradually, the specific way of experiencing the sacred that the Anunnaki represented became inaccessible. Not because it was false, but because the cultural technology to access it was lost. This is why the question of whether the Anunnaki were real misses the point entirely. They were as real as language is real as law is real, which is to say they existed within and through human cultural practice, shaping consciousness and being shaped by it. When the practice ended, that form of reality dissolved, leaving only traces, tablets in museums, names in scholarly indexes, patterns that migrated into new forms. But if the Anunnaki never left in a physical sense, If they only transformed, evolved, dissolved into structures we still use under different names, what do the tablets themselves still hold that modern readers are just beginning to understand? Return with me to where we began. The archive rooms, the museum's storage facilities, the climate-controlled spaces where thousands of clay fragments rest under soft light. Each tablet is a frozen moment. A scribe's hand pressing into wet clay 4,000 years ago, recording what needed to be remembered. Some are the size of your palm, others barely larger than a postage stamp. Their surfaces are covered in wedge-shaped impressions that look to the untrained eye like abstract patterns. But to those who can read them, their voices, administrative records, royal hymns, temple inventories, mythological narratives, each one a data point in the slow transformation we've been tracking. Let's read them chronologically like pages in a book that no one intended to write. The earliest texts from the mid-3rd millennium BC, the early dynastic period of Sumer, present the Anunnaki with clarity and prominence. In administrative texts from Nippur and Lagash, they appear in offering lists. Quantities of bread, beer, and sheep allocated to the Anunnaki. In royal inscriptions, kings claim authority by the decree of the Anunnaki. In literary compositions like the Song of the Ho, they're described as the gods who approved Enlil's creation of humanity. They're not background figures. They're structural, woven into the language of legitimate power. A tablet from Shurupak, dating to around 2600 BC, lists the Anunnaki among the witnesses when major divine decisions are made. Another from Girsu records an oath sworn by An and the Anunnaki, invoking them as the ultimate guarantors of truth. In these early texts, they're treated as self-evidently important, requiring no explanation. The scribes assume their audience knows who the Anunnaki are and why their names carry weight. Move forward to the Akkadian period, late 3rd millennium BC, and the picture begins to shift. The Anunnaki still appear, but now often in Akkadian translations, where Sumerian originals said something slightly different. They're still invoked in royal inscriptions, still mentioned in mythological texts, but the emphasis has changed. A hymn to Ishtar from this period mentions her authority over all the great gods, with the Anunnaki subsumed into that broader category. The specificity is beginning to blur. Old Babylonian texts from the early 2nd millennium BC show the transformation accelerating. Here we find the Anunnaki in Inanna's descent, sitting as judges in the underworld rather than decreeing fates in heaven. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're mentioned briefly as the gods who decreed that Enkidu must die. A decision made by the council, but one that feels mechanical, procedural, lacking the cosmic weight of earlier texts. They're present, but diminished. Still structurally necessary, but no longer the center of divine authority. By the Kassite and Middle Babylonian periods, middle to late 2nd millennium BC, explicit mentions of the Anunnaki become rarer. You find them in scholarly texts, in lists of divine names compiled by scribes preserving tradition. You find them in religious commentaries explaining older myths. But in contemporary royal inscriptions, in prayers composed for current use, the term appears less frequently. Kings invoke all the great gods or list specific major deities, Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash. But the Anunnaki as a named collective are fading from active religious vocabulary. In Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts, 1st millennium BC, the references become fragmentary. A scholar copying an ancient hymn includes them because that's what the original said, but contemporary compositions increasingly omit them. The gods who matter now are the patron deities of empires. Ashur for Assyria, Marduk for Babylon. The old council structure is linguistically preserved but functionally irrelevant. Now here's what's striking about this 4,000-year archive. Nowhere in any of these texts, not in the earliest, not in the middle periods, not in the latest fragments, does any scribe record anything resembling a departure announcement. There's no tablet that says, "In this year, the Anunnaki held their final council and ascended to the heavens, not to return. There's no royal chronicle mentioning that the gods withdrew from their temples. There's no priestly lament describing the moment when the divine presence departed. The silence is total, and that silence is itself the answer to our question. Modern minds, especially those influenced by science fiction and ancient astronaut theories, expect gods who came from elsewhere to eventually return there. We imagine departure scenes, spacecraft ascending, portals closing, divine beings waving goodbye as they retreat to higher dimensions. We read ancient texts looking for that moment of exit. And when we don't find it, we assume it must have been hidden, coded, or lost. But the tablets reveal something more mundane and more profound. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never the kind of beings that could leave. They weren't travelers. They were the structure itself, the way Mesopotamian civilization organized its understanding of cosmic authority. And what the tablets document isn't their departure, but their transformation. The slow reorganization of that structure across centuries of political and theological change. Watch the pattern emerge when you read the tablets in sequence. Early Anunnaki as Supreme Council, decreeing fates collectively representing the distributed power structure of independent city-states. Middle Anunnaki subordinated to rising imperial gods like Marduk, reflecting the consolidation of political power into empires. Late Anunnaki relegated to underworld roles, or absorbed into generic categories as newer religious systems emphasized individual supreme deities over councils. Final Anunnaki mentioned only in scholarly copies of ancient texts, their active function replaced by monotheistic frameworks that had no structural place for divine assemblies. This is what theological evolution looks like in real time, documented in clay. Not a dramatic event, but a gradual drift. Names used less frequently, roles reassigned, importance diminished, until eventually the term survives only as an artifact of linguistic history. The tablets don't record the Anunnaki leaving Earth because that's not what happened. What happened was that Mesopotamian civilization evolved beyond the religious structures that made the Anunnaki meaningful. City-states became empires. Local gods became universal ones. Polytheistic systems were challenged and eventually replaced by monotheistic ones. And in that transformation, the Anunnaki, like countless other divine figures, were reorganized, reassigned, and finally made obsolete. Here's the synthesis. The archaeology shows us temples abandoned not in catastrophe, but in gradual neglect. The textual evidence shows us names fading from active use over centuries. The religious history shows us newer systems absorbing and redefining older structures. The psychology shows us how sacred presence migrates when ritual ceases. Every strand of evidence points to the same conclusion. The Anunnaki changed with us, not independent of us. They were never separate from the civilization that conceived them. When that civilization evolved, when new empires brought new political structures, when new religions offered new ways of understanding the sacred, the Anunnaki evolved too. From cosmic legislators, to divine bureaucrats, to underworld judges, to half-remembered names in ancient texts. Each transformation tracked exactly with changes in human, political, and religious organization. The tablets reveal this if you read them not for what they confirm about modern theories, but for what they actually say, that the story of the Anunnaki is the story of how humans organize power, authority, and meaning through divine structures. When those structures no longer serve their purpose, they don't violently collapse. They gradually fade, repurposed, or abandoned as consciousness finds new forms. If this is what the tablets quietly reveal, that the Anunnaki's departure was really our evolution, that their absence is really our transformation, then what does that mean for us? Standing now in museum archives and desert ruins, still asking about gods who vanished thousands of years ago. You're standing in the ruins again, not the museum archives with their controlled temperature and protective glass, but the actual place where it all began, Nippur, or what remains of it in southern Iraq, where the wind carries sand across broken mud brick It's late afternoon, moving toward dusk. The ziggurat of Enlil, once the most sacred structure in Sumer, the place where the Anunnaki gathered to decree the fates of kings, is now just a massive mound of eroded earth, with ancient walls barely visible beneath centuries of accumulated dust. The shadows are lengthening. The heat of the day is finally breaking. And as you walk through what was once the sacred courtyard, the same wind that moved across these stones when priests performed dawn rituals 4,000 years ago moves across them now, indifferent to the collapse of everything that once made this place the center of the world. But something has changed since you first arrived at these ruins, asking where the Anunnaki went. Now you understand. They didn't go anywhere. They transformed layer by layer through mechanisms we've traced across 9 chapters of evidence. Political reorganization, theological demotion, religious replacement, ritual abandonment, cultural evolution, and finally the simple fading that occurs when no one speaks a name anymore. The Anunnaki were never visitors who could pack up and leave. They were the way an entire civilization structured its relationship with cosmic authority, with sacred order, with the forces that made rivers flood predictably, and kings rule legitimately, and cities prosper under divine protection. They were the answer ancient Mesopotamia gave to the fundamental human questions. Who governs the cosmos? What makes power legitimate? How do we connect the eternal with the temporary, the divine with the earthly? And when those questions needed different answers, when city-states became empires, when local gods needed to become universal, when polytheism gave way to monotheism, the Anunnaki didn't resist or flee. They simply dissolved into new forms, their structural DNA preserved even as their specific identity faded. The divine council became the angelic hierarchy. The cosmic legislators became celestial bureaucrats. The witnesses of fate became the judged rather than the judges. The names changed, the story shifted, and eventually even the memory grew faint until all that remained were clay tablets waiting in the dark for someone to remember how to read them. This is the real revelation the Sumerian tablets offer. Not a hidden history of ancient astronauts, but something more profound and more human. The pattern of how we create gods to meet our needs. Crown them with supreme authority, then slowly demote them when new needs arise. We reshape the sacred to match our evolving consciousness, and we do it so gradually that we rarely notice the transformation happening. The Anunnaki left when Sumer's world ended, when the last person who could read Sumerian died, when the final temple closed, when the rituals that maintained their presence ceased. But the sacred instinct that created them never ended. It just found new forms, new names, new structures. Every age builds its own divine architecture, its own way of organizing the mystery that Otto called the numinous. The specific form the Anunnaki took, 50 great gods in assembly, decreeing fates from a ziggurat in Nippur. That form was perfectly adapted to Bronze Age Mesopotamia. When that world ended, the form ended with it. Which brings us to this moment, to why we're still asking about the Anunnaki thousands of years after their names stopped being spoken in prayer. Our modern obsession with ancient aliens and lost civilizations isn't really about history. It's mythology, dressed in the language of science fiction. New stories we're telling about old mysteries, new ways of making the distant past seem more dramatic, more relevant, more connected to our technological present. When we imagine the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials, we're doing exactly what the Babylonians did when they reimagined them as Marduk's servants. We're reshaping old gods to fit our current worldview. The Babylonians needed imperial hierarchy, so they made the Anunnaki into subordinates. We're fascinated by space travel and advanced technology, so we make them into ancient astronauts. In a strange way, this means the Anunnaki are still alive, not as the beings the Sumerians worshipped, but as symbols we continue to reshape according to our needs. Every YouTube video claiming they were aliens, every documentary speculating about their technology, every theory about their return. These are the modern rituals, the contemporary way of keeping their names in circulation. We've replaced temple offerings with internet attention, hymns with podcast episodes, clay tablets with digital archives. The form has changed completely, but the impulse remains. We're still trying to make sense of these ancient beings, still trying to fit them into frameworks that help us understand our place in the cosmos. Perhaps every age creates its own version of the Anunnaki, its own mysterious powers that seem to operate beyond normal human comprehension. The Sumerians made them divine legislators. The Babylonians made them imperial servants. The Zoroastrians and Christians made them demons or false gods. And we've made them aliens, visitors from beyond who possessed knowledge we're only now beginning to rediscover. Each interpretation reveals more about the interpreters than about the interpreted. Stand here in the ruins as the last light fades, and you can almost feel the weight of that pattern. The endless human cycle of reaching toward the sacred, giving it form and name and ritual, then watching those forms slowly change or fade as consciousness evolves. The Anunnaki are just one instance of something that happens over and over. Gods rise when they serve a need, and they fall when they no longer do. Not because they were false, but because the human world that sustained them transformed into something new. The tablets sit in museums now behind glass under conservation quality light. Scholars study them, translating the wedge-shaped marks back into words, reconstructing the myths and hymns and administrative records that once made the Anunnaki real within Mesopotamian consciousness. And in that act of reading, something peculiar happens. The Anunnaki flicker back into a kind of existence. Not the existence they had when priests fed their statues and sang their praises, but a different kind. The existence of being known, remembered, studied, wondered about. Maybe that's all gods ever were. Patterns of meaning that exist in the relationship between human consciousness and the mysteries it faces. They're real when they're active in culture, when rituals maintain them and stories transmit them and communities organize around them. They fade when that cultural support dissolves, and they can return in altered forms when new communities find new reasons to remember them. The wind moves across the ruins, the same wind that's been blowing here for 5,000 years. The ziggurat is barely visible now in the gathering darkness, just a massive shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Somewhere beneath your feet are tablets still unexcavated, still waiting in the earth, still holding marks pressed there by hands that wanted to preserve something against the erasing power of time. Those tablets won't tell you where the Anunnaki went, but they'll tell you something more important. How human beings have always reached toward the infinite, given it names and forms, built structures to honor it. Then watch those structures crumble as the world changed and new forms became necessary. Every age has its own Anunnaki, its own way of naming the mystery, its own structures for encountering the sacred, its own gods that seem eternal until they're not. The Sumerians had their cosmic council. We have our own frameworks now, our own ways of organizing meaning and power, and the sense that something larger than us governs existence. You turn from the ruins and begin walking back as darkness settles. The question that lingers isn't where did the Anunnaki go? That's answered. They dissolved into the transformation of human consciousness, repurposed and renamed and eventually forgotten, except as subjects of scholarly study and speculative reinterpretation. The question that lingers is softer, more unsettling, more immediate. If the Anunnaki are what happens when a civilization tries to make sense of the cosmos, when it builds divine structures to organize meaning, then watches those structures slowly become obsolete. What new gods are we quietly shaping today? What names are we giving to the mystery? What rituals are we performing without recognizing them as sacred? And when future archaeologists dig through our ruins, what will they conclude about the powers we honored, then forgot, then transformed into something they won't quite recognize? The tablets hold their silence. The wind continues, and somewhere in the dark, the pattern repeats as it always has, as perhaps it always It's late afternoon, moving toward dusk. The ziggurat of Enlil, once the most sacred structure in Sumer, the place where the Anunnaki gathered to decree the fates of kings, is now just a massive mound of eroded earth with ancient walls barely visible beneath centuries of accumulated dust. The shadows are lengthening. The heat of the day is finally breaking. And as you walk through what was once the sacred courtyard, the same wind that moved across these stones when priests performed dawn rituals 4,000 years ago moves across them now, indifferent to the collapse of everything that once made this place the center of the world. But something has changed since you first arrived at these ruins, asking where the Anunnaki went. Now you understand. They didn't.